how you know that it's live. Let's see here. So, real quick, hopefully you can read that. Real quick show of hands before we dive in. I'm just curious, how many folks have had experience with BeyondCorp before, have seen another presentation on it, versus it being totally new? Yeah? Excellent. I see some nods, I see some hands, excellent. So I'm going to start with a terrible analogy of BeyondCorp, because when I saw this a few weeks ago on Twitter, it cracked me up, and I think it really highlights if you aren't following kind of what the idea behind BeyondCorp is, what a perceived issue with it could be that isn't in actuality. So, like the title of the presentation says, BeyondCorp is really a post-perimeter security design. Yeah. And so this tweet, and forgive me if I misquote it, I should have grabbed a screenshot of it, was, so BeyondCorp is like taking the front door off your house and just asking everybody who they are once they're inside, right? Right? So the idea there is that by giving up what we think of as the ironclad perimeter, we're sacrificing security. And that's a scary idea. But the reality is that our networks have changed. We don't use technology in the enterprise or in our organizations the way that we used to. This is kind of a really ugly diagram. Forgive me, this is what happens when you let me have free reign with an icon program. So, you know, it's fairly traditional. You know, we've got our perimeter here, and we've got our workstations. We've got our email services, our directory services, our administrative tools, all going through our firewall out to the internet. And maybe, you know, we have some users that are going to have to work externally, and so we set up a VPN here, and so then they on their devices can dial in. But then, you know, technology moved forward, and people started to see a lot of value in being able to leverage the scalable architecture in the cloud, and so all of these things started to move externally. Now we've got a whole other cloud component sitting outside of our perimeter, and we've got our mobile devices that users are starting to bring in because now some of our service are directly accessible through an external URL. You know, and we have more users that want to bring their own devices for those things that they can. And then even more of our tools start to move outside. So more of our administrative, our logging, our security advisory tools are moving outside of the perimeter. So we've got tools for securing these within that traditional firewall mindset. But the reality is that we now have a much more porous perimeter than we like to think of it as. You know, we've got our VPN traffic, we've got remote desktop logins, we've got email traffic, all coming in through the perimeter. And so the question becomes, what are we doing to actually enforce policy on all of these? So when we're looking at the new perimeter, or the perimeterless model, there's a lot more that we need to take into account when we're thinking about how we protect that. We've got our remote employees, we have now cloud applications, we have potentially users bringing their own devices. I say that there are two kinds of companies, those that have a BYOD environment and those that are in denial. So users are going to bring their devices and access anything that they possibly can because of the convenience factor, and we need to figure out how we're going to account for that. As we have more of these things that are moving to cloud-hosted environments, now we have a much higher potential risk through our vendors and contractors, who now may never set foot onto our actual enterprise property, be going through that vetting process. They're working on the systems that their company is responsible for, possibly completely in the background, with you ever having any interaction with them whatsoever. And so now you've got a lot of complexity. You've got some great scalable tools, but you're kind of juggling two completely separate environments. We're thinking about our internal environments, and we think of the stuff that's happening inside of that as safe, and that we don't need to worry about it because it's been past all of our checks to get into that perimeter. We think of kind of everything else, and there's a little bit more of a mishmash. Maybe you have an MDM that's going to be able to lock down access to some of these external services. Maybe you have other users with devices that aren't using that MDM, and so they're able to access directly. The reality is, users and devices are where breaches come from. And a breached user or a breached device that's behind your perimeter means that your perimeter suddenly does a whole lot less for you than it would otherwise. And these numbers are down. I think that was 90 in the 2016 data breach report from Verizon. It was like 90% were breached or weak credentials. So the question becomes, if we take a step back and think about security as its absolute basic core components. To be able to secure an environment, we need to know two things. We need to know what's happening, and we need to be able to take action on what's happening. So if you think about the larger problem that you have, whether it's an internal device, an external device hitting an internal or an external resource, you have two questions to solve. You want to figure out how do you stop attacks that have stolen but valid credentials, because these can be phished, these can be harvested because somebody put a sticky pad or a sticky note under their keyboard. Passwords by themselves, we know if we rely just on them, it's kind of a losing game. And how do you make sure that devices that don't match your company's security hygiene policy aren't able to access those critical applications? So this is kind of where we can start to see some of the advantage of flipping this model on its head, and instead of thinking about a traditional responsive security model, we start to think about being proactive. So this is kind of a traditional model. If you have a new vulnerability, you've got some risk the day that it's discovered, but really your risk reaches its height when that 0 day hits the market and starts to be used in the wild. And then slowly over time, you're going to see that potential risk drop as you go through and patch your devices, try to remediate users that may have slipped through the cracks, or if one of those devices has already been exploited, to identify it and to replace it. If we flip that model and we start thinking proactively about the health of our devices every time that a user is going to connect, we can flip that around on its head. So if we are aware and making sure that our users are only accessing our applications with devices that meet our security hygiene, we'll talk about kind of some of the factors that can go into that, your risk is actually relatively low the day that it's discovered, because it's fairly rare that the vulnerability identified is absolutely brand new in the very newest update of that software. I say fairly rare because just last 2 weeks ago, Mac OS had a fun little issue where you had a default root login, no password exposure. So there's exceptions that prove every rule. But now your risk is still going to go up as that begins to hit the market. But if you're actively enforcing that security policy and forcing users to be up to date on their devices, or move to a device that is able to be up to date, now you are going to have that risk go up as it becomes more common, but then you're able to issue a patch, and you can even change your policy and require users to be on that patch before they update. And so now your risk is going to drop significantly after that. So when we think about a connection, we have maybe more, but basically 3 elements in that connection. You have a user, the human, the source of all PEBCAC problems, who is going to be that person that is interacting with the system. They're going to be viewing the data. We need to make sure that they are who they say they are and the person that's supposed to view it. They're going to have at least one device, the device that's accessing that data, and then very often, if you're using a modern authentication solution, like a company that I won't name, you may be authenticating with a separate device, a mobile phone or a tablet. And then there's a network that it's connecting through. And so you want to make sure that that network can be trusted, or that at least you can trust it for that connection. So this is the problem that Google was trying to solve when they developed BeyondCorp. And the idea with BeyondCorp is, if we begin to think about each connection, rather than thinking about our systems and services as inside or outside of a perimeter, if we begin thinking about what we need to trust each individual connection, we want to validate the health of that device, that that user is who they say they are with strong authentication, and the health of that network every time they go to connect. And so the way that Google went about this was they basically built 2 parallel infrastructures. One was already existing, and that was managing their internal network here. And so they have their directory services, they have their certificate service, they're managing their device inventory. It's going through a trust check, going through their control engine, and from there going through the proxy. And so they just kind of replicated that for external connections, using some technology, single sign-on, and then using some hosted directory services. Not everybody's a Google. Very few people are a Google. And so this is a model that can benefit a lot of organizations that may or may not have that same sort of security budget. So Duo actually had partnered with Google to provide a commercial release of BeyondCorp. Now I'm going to preface this by saying as we go through here, I'm going to touch on how Duo has implemented some of these ideas. Please just raise a hand if it feels too pitchy, because that's not my goal. I want to use it more as an example of these universal ideas and how we employed them, but you don't have to go about it the same way that we did. So Duo has the advantage that we have a scaled infrastructure in the cloud, and so really all that the customer has to do is be able to get to us to do that secondary authentication. Without getting too far into the architecture of how our authentication service works, Duo is not meant to be a replacement for primary authentication. By design, we are coming in after primary authentication has successfully been validated. We do that for a couple of reasons. One, we don't want you to have to pass those credentials outside of your environment. And two, we think that there's value in having sandboxing between your primary and secondary credentials, just like there is between the primary and secondary devices that you're authenticating with. So with Duo, you're going to have a user. Now this user can be inside your local environment or remote, sitting on a beach somewhere on vacation, doesn't matter. Either way, they're going to be tested against the user directory when they go to authenticate. If you are having a managed versus unmanaged device environment, which is something that we support, that device can check to see if it is included in the managed device inventory, or that step can be skipped if you don't have a policy for that. And then that device, at the point that it's going to log in, is doing that check. I describe it as, think of a bouncer every time a user is going to log in. They can get all the way up to that door. Maybe they had their ID checked at the lobby, and now they're to the inside door, but if their name isn't on that list, if they're not dressed in the right clothes, if they don't know the password, probably should have set that to not timeout. If they don't know the password, they're not getting past it. And so this means that you're able to enforce your security policy at the point of access. And now you're thinking about the user, the device, and the network. It no longer matters if you're talking about a user that's sitting inside your environment or outside. That's the idea of a zero trust network. It doesn't mean that you're dropping your barriers and you're just letting anybody in that wants to come. It's taking the approach of saying, if I assume that I can trust absolutely nothing between this user and the resource that they're getting to, what do I need to validate to trust that connection? So the first piece of that is trusted users. It's making sure that you're only allowing the users that are known, that are validated, that have valid credentials. It's advisable. I mean, the new NIST recommendations came out and just reiterated the importance, even as we're evolving on how we make recommendations for handling passwords, what the optimal password creation policies are, and whether or not they should be refreshed periodically. One thing that stayed consistent is that a strong authentication or multi-factor authentication has remained one of kind of those baseline controls that's recommended to protect a user. You can have a 32-character password, but it can still fail the sticky note test. So, regardless of location, yes. So here's an example of that in practice. The way that this environment is set up that I just talked about, in order for a user to be compromised, now we're not talking about just getting that username and password. We're talking about getting that username, that password, being able to intercept that second factor, and in many cases, with the way that we've implemented it, actually physically having that trusted device. So I'm going to pause there for just a second, explain why the fourth element is true. So with any two-factor solution, you're going to need to have the second factor. And so if you have sort of a legacy approach, where you enter your username, you enter your password, and then you have a second password field, and you enter the code that's generated or that's texted to you or what have you. It's definitely stronger than just a password. It beats the heck out of claiming a second factor from a knowledge question or a security image or something like that. But it's still not optimal, because that's still a single point of failure on that machine. If that machine's been compromised with a man-in-the-middle attack, Those credentials are phished through a fake page. Now all of that information is in one place that that attacker can replay. If you're using an out-of-band authentication method, and a couple examples of that would be a push that goes to a user's device, and they're approving and viewing that on that device, separate from the machine they're logging in from. Another example would be a YubiKey, where it's doing an encrypted handshake through the browser. So even if there is somebody listening in on that connection, it's an encrypted transmission, and they're not going to be able to capture it. Now you need to physically have that device. Now, in the way that Duo goes about it, when a user receives a push, it's not actually just sending an OTP in the background and having that user approve or deny it. It's actually doing an encrypted handshake. So when a user enrolls their device and they scan a barcode to add that account to Duo, it is generating a secure private key stored in the HSM of that mobile device and located nowhere else. So now you have your primary credentials, which are however you're managing that today. Maybe you're going through ping or AD or what have you. And now you have your second factor, which is going to be identified by the public key for your integration within Duo. And now you have actually that actual device, which is the only place.
I'm sorry, go finish.
No, only place where that private key is stored.
So would I do this for BYOD devices as well, or just my devices that are corporately owned?
So it can work with either,
I installed on my own device when I'm coming to the customer. I'm using Duo exactly what she's describing.
Yeah.
This is my phone, and I have a corporate computer, and it pushes. As soon as on the computer I'm logging into the VPN and the Citrix, pushing the button, it actually shows up right here. I have to approve it, and that's double handshake goes through.
So this is something that you can do with any integration. The way that we distinguish between managed and unmanaged devices is in Duo Beyond, managed devices are those that you've added a bit of Duo signed code to identify. But otherwise, if you have unmanaged devices and you want to enforce this policy, you just require that in order for users to log into this resource, they have to either receive an invite or you prompt them on the first login to enroll their phone.
I guess I have a distinction, right? So when I see trusted device, that tells me that we are scanning it, we're making sure that nothing is happening to it, et cetera, et cetera. But in this case, you're not necessarily saying you're saying it's a known device, not a trusted device, because his phone to that corporate entity is not trusted. His phone is known, but not trusted.
So there is an administrator, the way it went, I actually had to contact the regular administrator who is including my phone in the database of the trusted registered devices.
But that's not a trusted device.
No, but nobody's scanning my device.
That's correct. That's my point.
So a self-enrolled phone would not be considered a trusted device. It can pass a trust check at the point that it's going to log in. But a trusted device, as we're looking at it here, or a managed device as we're looking at it here, is those that the company has issued and managing.
Okay, that's the one. And when I saw trusted, I'm like, wait a minute. As you describe it, that doesn't necessarily mean a BYOD. Yes, I would have to register my BYOD device, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that phone hasn't been compromised. And now it's just known that it's known to me, but it's still a compromised device.
When we're talking about being able to trust that device, we're talking about for that authentication only. We're extending trust only so far as this check for this authentication. So the scan that you're talking about, the health check and all of that, that's what we're doing at that point of access.
I'm not suggesting it's bad, because it's accountability, right?
No, absolutely.
If we figured out that the 0 day that happened on the network happened because I brought my BYOD device in, we know where it came from, right?
Right.
The device is known, so it makes perfect sense. It's just not, the word trusted was like, whoa.
Totally makes sense.
Got it. Okay.
A little bit of it, I will say, is to have a thematic association of trusting access end-to-end. But you're right. When we're talking about trusted devices in terms of a device being trusted long-term, we're talking about...
I can't see my tinfoil hat, but I'm a very
I appreciate that.
trusted person.
No, these are the questions that I love to hear, because it means that people are trying to do more than check the box, and that's what the goal always is. So let's have an example of maybe for company calendars, we have a pretty strict information policy about what you can share in a calendar invite or on a shared calendar. So we want to allow any user that's able to match that policy for access to be able to add on their personal phone to see their calendar. But say for our back-end DevOps systems, we want to make sure that the only devices that are connecting to that are our managed device environment that we issue out to them, that maybe we've got AirWatch or Mobile Iron, or that we have a stock VPN that's installed on and can only connect through. So there would be where you can identify those devices as managed, and you can have separate policy to manage them. So not every resource and not every user is going to be accessing the same sensitivity of data every time, and this means that you can really kind of get granular in how you're applying that policy. When you start to think about the individual elements of the connection, you can really get, rather than just having two policies, one to manage your internal and one to manage your external resources, now you're really able to get granular on it. And I think I'm getting ahead of myself because I've got that on another slide. So this is just an example of how Duo has gone about self-remediation. One of the things that we're trying to encourage users to do is make sure that they meet that health check requirement whenever they go to log in. So this screenshot here is of a user that's going to log into an integration that their device does not meet the current policy. They're 31 days out of date, and the policy that's been set by the administrator is they have to be up to date within 2 weeks of when a new update for that software is released. So we try and make it as intuitive as possible. We give them the option of how to go and update it, but it's changing the approach to enforcing that security policy. Instead of the traditional approach where security is the watchdogs that's making sure that users don't burn everything to the ground, and there's this kind of pseudo-adversarial relationship between them where we're pulling back and trying to keep them from doing anything, we're flipping that on its head, because the motivation there for users is to try and find, they apply their security mindset, and then they try and find an end run around those policies. When we're able to flip that, we can say, hey, you have your device, and for these integrations, it's absolutely fine for you to use your device to access it. But if you want that convenience, you're going to have to meet this threshold. You're going to have to meet these policies. So the way that, I don't think I have a slide on this, so I'll touch on how Duo's handling that. Within Duo, the way that we're doing those health checks, on a mobile device, it's through the Duo mobile app. We don't have to request any special permissions. We don't have to install an agent on the device. The default developer permissions tell us most of what we need to know. What version of the mobile OS is that phone on? Is it using full disk encryption? Are they using a PIN screen? Are they using biometrics? Are they using an approved browser that your organization is comfortable with them using, and is that up to date? On desktops, currently, we apply that through user agent, so it'll work on any web-based integration, and it's going to be telling us, similarly, OS version, if Flash and Java are installed, God help us all, and how up-to-date they are, the browser version, all that. Yes?
Is that JavaScript-based fingerprinting?
Yes, it's just through the browser user agent.
Okay, right on.
So, when you're enforcing that device policy, now you have this user with a device that's going to a less privileged integration. Their device is out of date. Now they can get right up to that door, but the bouncer's telling them, sorry, those shoes are a little too shabby. You're going to have to get cleaned up before you can come in. And we try to make that as easy as possible on our end so that users can go ahead and do that themselves. But the truth is, there's some bad actors out there. We all know that there's some level of breaches that are going to come from internal actors, but the majority of your users want to do the right thing. They just don't always know what the right thing is, and if they're worried that security is going to bite their head off, they might be afraid to ask. So if we can make it easy for them to do the right thing, most users are going to do that, and then we can just worry about the edge cases. Now, I briefly touched on that every application is not going to be the same sensitivity. If you have, you're probably going to want to have a higher requirement for access if logging into the HR system and being able to view everybody's personal information versus if you have a limited wiki that is just for kind of public info. And so now when we're looking at our policies, we can set a baseline, and that baseline is universally applicable. Every device, internal, external, managed or unmanaged, for every integration. Now we can start layering that and say application specific. I can step up that authentication where I need to, or I can maintain that balance of security and convenience where it's not as crucial, or where it's not going to be, there's not going to be a significant risk reduction for impacting that user's workflow. And then above that, you can get further granular and say, group specific. Maybe 90% of my workforce is going to be working within these 5 countries where our offices operate. But then I have a set of travel admins that are going to be going on site to customer locations and need to have flexibility to log in anywhere. If I know that, I can really quickly reduce risk and say, I only want to allow logins from these countries where our users should be logging in from, except for this subset of users that needs more flexibility. And so then they are going to be able to log in anywhere. So now, because you're doing that at that point of access, you may be doing it internal through radius authentication, you may be doing it externally through SAML or through a federation partner. You're able to apply that same policy. And you can get really granular. We talked a little bit about how you're checking that user's device, the mobile device that they're using, and the desktop or laptop device that they're using. But similar in the way that we've gone about it, we can get some IP or some network information as well. Geolocation, which I touched on. Also, if you have any sort of threat feed information, which on our side we do, you can immediately block, say, Tor exit nodes. You may have some users or researchers that are going to need to be able to access from there, but probably it's likely that that's not a user that you want to allow access to if they're coming from an anonymized proxy or a Tor exit node. And so you can very quickly disallow that. You can also set policy to deny any known malicious VPNs or anonymous proxies that are in that threat feed. Similarly, if you do have, say, legacy devices that aren't going to be able to be patched up to the newest level, you can whitelist for those separately. This is more usability than anything else. Now that you've got a way to secure everything and you're doing it in a distributed sort of way, you want to think about the usability for your users. If you want them to have a consistent process, you want to give them one place to go and log in. The good news is if you're enforcing this at the point of access, really now all you need to do is point to that directory service. So you're able to have both internal and external applications show up on the same page, with the added benefit that if you have folks logging in through a portal like this, you're able to make sure that they're doing that health check if they're on a desktop device. This is a repeat of what I just said. Yes?
Behind your, I guess it's you have operating a gateway. Is that how you're controlling users coming in, or what is it?
So what we do, it's going to depend on the application or integration that's being used specifically. I'll give you a couple of examples. If you're using a traditional VPN, like a Juniper or Cisco, a lot of those have support natively for a secondary sign-in screen. And so we provide you with a little package that you update that with your integration information. And then whenever users hit that, they're going to see the iframe of the Duo interface, and it's going to do that health check there. If you're dealing with, say, Active Directory services, or you're dealing with RDP, something like that, then what we do is we give you a software-based proxy. You can put it on any VM in your environment and handle it that way. You can either go through the single sign-on portal if you want to just link internal and external services. If you want to limit that access for internal services, the other way that we go about it is we have a reverse proxy that you can use. So you're really just opening up that one port and you're proxying that traffic through that gateway.
So what about non-interactive interactions between systems within the BeyondCorp?
So device-to-device authentication?
Internal, right?
Yeah.
All my systems inside that migrate, the horizontal migration is my biggest challenge right now.
Mm-hmm. So it's a question that's been coming up today. Our model is focused on users. That was the first problem that we're solving.
Exactly.
But the same principles can be applied to that. It just means that now instead of the user having something that they know and something that they have, now we're looking at these devices, and it's going to have to be something that they have and something else that they have, and certificates.
Still certificates everywhere. Yeah.
Exactly.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Two questions. First of all, how do you deal in the environment where the first entry point, endpoint is a mobile device? So you have to have the other mobile device? And the other question would be how do you deal with the offline environment? So once you're offline,
Yeah.
2 questions.
So the way that Duo deals with offline is we give you fallback methods. You can fail safe or fail secure. For most of the integrations that our customers are looking at, a network access is required for there really to be a threat. If somebody is standing there, they're not looking at being able to connect to the system that would be breached anyway. If you want to have that redundancy for offline access, you can do that through caching. Which is actually something that we have coming down the pipe for offline-based systems. The other thing that you can do that we do have customers doing today is if you have systems that are offline because they're air-gapped, you are able to configure our proxy to kind of work as a jump host. And so as long as you have somewhere in your environment that you can have outbound-only access, you can set that up as a proxy. So even if that machine itself is offline, but you have a network with internet access, you're able to configure that. For a mobile-only device, so you can force, if say you only want to allow users to log in from desktop or laptop, you can force and require that it's coming from a desktop OS rather than a mobile OS like Android or iOS. Otherwise, right now, you would be able to do that login and you can force a separate second factor device. The way that we're set up, you can have more than one authentication device enrolled.
Which is, because it's not available for the owners.
Right, so it could be if I have my phone enrolled and I'm logging into my phone, I have my tablet enrolled as a second authentication device and I'm authenticating.
You should have two hardware basic pieces.
We tell folks as long as it matches, that's all right. If you want to know my Twitter handle, I can put it back up there. We tell folks that as long as it matches what their security posture is, there can be some added security in users enrolling a backup device. It can be unintuitive on its face because if you have 2 things that you have, now you have twice as many things that you could potentially lose. But when you think about the actual process of validating users that have lost their device, now our security is falling back to that help desk employee that I'm calling on the phone who's trying to validate my identity. If you have a user that has a secondary device enrolled, say they have their phone enrolled and they have their tablet, even if they lose their phone, they're able to still securely log in with a second factor on that tablet, and they can either disable that phone, report it as lost or stolen, what have you. Does that help?
So Ross,
Yeah.
But
I've seen a presentation by some of the actual Google guys about BeyondCorp, and their attitude for internal servers and services was nobody touch it, no admins touch a box, no developers touch a box. You want to pull something off the box, you want codecs, you want to pull like logs off the box that you're not getting in the past. You write code, the code gets checked in, the code gets pushed to the boxes, you have to build a hook to report back out to wherever you want. There's nobody touching any machine. So
there's no interaction, well, it's all programmatic, right?
Right.
And they do that though with the control plane, where the control plane manages the interaction between all those devices programmatically, and that's what I think is going to be kind of revolutionary. Right?
And a bunch of the registration stuff that they do on the Kubernetes platform is now an open source project called Istio, which handles a bunch of the load balancing, the microservice management, as well as the certificate registration and point-to-point mutual TLS automatically just deploying the containers out.
And when you, one of the interesting things is seeing how folks have used push, which push, having an authentication go to a user smartphone, give them some contextual info, green button to approve, red button to deny. It's technology that we introduced in like 2011, but really it's not as groundbreaking now. It's something that the market as a whole has kind of adopted, but there's a lot of possibilities for how that out-of-band communications channel can be leveraged. One example is we have somebody that we had worked with that had a lot of automation running in their environments. And so what their perspective was, they were fine with most of these routine actions being triggered and run automatically. But for some elevated actions, they wanted to have a human double check it. And so they actually used the API to trigger a push notification whenever sudo was run. So any routine automation action that was going through, that could just, it would process, it would log as normal. But as soon as there was something that would trigger elevated admin privileged action, it would then hit up a human. It would show what that command was that was running, And again, it's going through a separate channel, so it's not going to be vulnerable to if somebody's trying to modify what's being shown as that action on a compromised machine. And then they approve it. We also have some folks that did that for investors. So it was a small investment firm. They work with a select group of like 10 million is the petty change investments that they're dealing with. And so they wanted to have an added level of security for wire transfers. So when one of their customers goes to make a wire transfer, they say what they want to approve, where the destination is, yada yada, and then along with that normal contextual info that you get when you're going to log in, it says destination, wire account, and amount. So even if that information is being modified on the user's endpoint, it's going to be going to a separate device to validate that. So that doesn't get you to full device-to-device authentication. That still is a level of human intervention. But it's kind of moving in that direction, and it gives you some more flexibility in how you structure those workflows.
So I have a question that demonstrates that I'm from DC. So 863 is a NIST guideline that came out recently that has scalars for, I think you said you will rely on your identity, so my identity authenticate assurance level will be mine, but for the authentication assurance level or federation assurance level, are you guys thinking about doing any measurement of this in those scalar functions?
Push is AAL3. So now with we moved from the level of assurance LOA to AAL, FAL, and IAL. Yeah. So where we're playing at is push is going to be an AAL3 level authentication, so you can use it. You would still be using your identity provider that would have to meet whatever the IAL is for that authentication, but we can make sure that you are able to have granular control for any AAL component of access.
And are you going to measure that in your system? So if you see somebody showing with a, I mean, are those scalars important to you? If somebody comes in with a Federation Assurance Level 2, are you going to elevate them to a 3? Are you measuring that? And are you building your capabilities to actually go after those scalars, I guess, is my question, right?
So right now, I believe that the level of user federation access that we were doing would be if you are managing your users based on their federation level through groups. So we're not tying directly into that right now.
They would designate a group and then...
But I think it's inevitable. I mean, I think that like there's an evolving conversation of how we're breaking down, how we're authenticating access, and I think it's the next logical step.
And I'm trying to consider what I need to manage in terms of monitoring those capabilities too, the scalars.
Mm-hmm.
And where I would do that.
There's a lot in that those latest NIST guidelines that we're really encouraging to see, because it shows that we're moving past the idea of you know, if it's really high security, we need to have that. It's going to be PIV and CAC, and that's it, right? And so now we're able to get a lot more granular, even within a single deployment or a single resource, and get more granular in how we're controlling that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I'm an old submariner, and one of the things I remember about security is if you try to secure everything at the highest level, you likely aren't going to secure the things you want to at the right level, right? So, I mean, I'm encouraged that there's a lot of things we do that a lower assurance level is probably the right thing to do for most things we do. And then make sure that you elevate when you know you need to elevate. And it's totally the opposite of the way that the government has looked at this over time, but I think it's one of the things that keeps us from being able to control our access interactions properly anyway, as we're not doing everything's like,
It's a paradigm change. It's a paradigm change because it's a culture change.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it is.
It's going from zero risk to risk mitigation, which is,
That's right.
you know, that's what the rest of the real world does. The government works in a zero risk world. If you can't eliminate all risk, then we don't want to do it. And obviously that's
That keeps us from eliminating or
The hammers
having
us.
trouble doing everything at the highest level because it's not possible to do everything at the highest level.
It's
Well,
interesting.
The problem is the data stewards, the resource owners are now need to think about what data, what they have, and figure out for these various assurance levels or combinations that you want to do, 863 math. What are you going to give for somebody that's at this level, at this level, at this level? How would you divide that up? And they're unable to think that way.
My interaction
That's
with
too
most
hard for
data,
them.
they actually don't have any idea. When you ask the question, how sensitive is your data, they're always like, oh, it's really high. then when you talk to them about what they have to do to secure, really high data, they're like, oh, it's really low. I mean, there's no rationale to what they're doing. They don't understand, what is the risk associated with the data I'm managing, generally speaking.
Because we think of risk as the enemy, because it's our job to try and eliminate or reduce it wherever we can, we tend to think of it as a zero-sum game where any potential increase, even marginally in risk, is something that we absolutely need to avoid. But if giving a tiny bit or gaining a bit of risk in exchange for much higher usability that increases the likelihood of your users doing it, that may not be a trade-off. And to make that a less abstract idea, we do an annual report called the Trusted Access Report, and it's on sort of the health of 7 million or so devices. And what we found was that on mobile devices that were capable of fingerprint authentication, about 78% of users had, exactly 78% of users had a lock screen or PIN code on their device. For phones that had that fingerprint scanner ability, that percentage goes up to 92%. When you allow users to have a fingerprint authentication, you are getting an increase in risk because now your user is susceptible to the broken knuckles attack, which isn't really going to do you that much good if you're trying to go through every possible permutation of a PIN code. But if it means that you have several hundred more users that now don't see it as a hassle and don't try and get around having to have a PIN code on their device, the much larger risk of those users losing that device and having it picked up is now going to be mitigated.
All right, I'm stupid. What's the broken knuckle attack? Is that them breaking my finger off and?
Yeah, it's the put your
Okay.
finger on here, we're going to break all your knuckles.
There is nothing on my phone that somebody would be worth breaking my finger.
That's fair.
Seriously.
It was a pretty grisly white paper, I'll tell you.
I remember a fun government customer that it was like, there were real situations where the broken knuckles attack had happened, and they wanted a different set of passwords that was the duress password to allow the authentication to happen and allow you to get in, but then it would automatically flag the audit of, oh shit, one of our assets is in trouble. So you have an IAM solution to do that, I go, multiple passwords, no, but we can figure it out.
I know what the last finger is, too.
The fingerprint. I was at a
different direction,
hacking conference in Colorado, and this guy, I mean, literally, the phone had only been out like 3 months, and he's like, here's my fingerprint, and he had a stick with this little rubber thing on it, and he's like, watch this. Beep. And I'm like, okay, wait a minute, hold on a second. And he's like, yeah, he said it took me 80 hours a week, he literally was at it, but he literally lifted the fingerprint off of the iPhone screen and recreated it with the exact specification that he could put the little stick, push it on the fingerprint reader, and I was just like, can I work for you? I mean, I'm just done. Like,
all of these sensors have, biometric sensors have, different types, different gradation of security, right? Liability can be built into anything, but you have to figure out if you're going to spend the money to do the liability checks, right? And to make sure that you're not being.
See, I think that's what that guy did was more plausible than somebody actually sitting there and saying, give me your phone and let me break your fingers. But you're right. I definitely am not important. The people you were dealing with were definitely a lot more important than I was.
The gummy bear attack's been around for decades now.
Yeah.
So. And as for liability,
In
those
the end,
people
it boils down to cost-benefit analysis.
That's
right?
exactly it, but that goes back to
How much is the end
risk.
consumer willing to pay for that phone that you want to do while you're bring your own device in? So
I've seen some pretty sophisticated devices, right?
Yeah, but
With vein checks and temperature sensors and 5 modes of liability checks integrated in the same device. You really have to spoof that. And,
Oh, I agree.
That's to my point. There is some information that we probably need to protect really well. And then there's a lot of it that doesn't need that level of protection. So for most of us accessing the system, worrying about somebody breaking a finger and putting it on it's probably not.
But to your point, the government likes to use what you just suggested on CUI, right? Because it, God forbid, it doesn't pass the FOIA Act, right? So they'll sit there and put all these things, as you said, PIV and CAC, to secure what? Like, what?
Anyway.
even,
I don't even want to tell you how many, hey, we're going to lunch today. Like, you're thinking 50 years from now, someone's going to be like, oh, that's awesome. They went to lunch.
right, even when your threat model needs to account for individual attention from a state actor, that doesn't mean that every asset is going to have the same value to them. So we can make sure that we shore up those areas that really do need to be, absolutely rock solid, and we can trade off a little bit of convenience to get our users buy-in and participation in that process.
I mean, in the government's defense, they had the choice between PKI and username and password, and so they chose PKI. And the people I work with, the various agencies, are recognizing that there's this middle ground, and I think we're going to see a lot of progress. But it depends on how enlightened or not unenlightened the various government sponsors are, and of course, it's across the range.
Yeah, you just don't want to be the first ISO that approves it.
Right.
But as soon as that first one approves it, it's going to be an avalanche for the usability aspect.
That's true.
So it'll still make it get back to what I talked about is the data people, the challenges for the data people to figure out which stuff they're trying to protect, because those guys are still in the mindset of, I'll give you an account one by one.
Yeah.
When you show that you need to get to my data, and so they're 2 generations behind.
Hey, look, there's huge user migrating, migrating the user identity down through the stack is still a real problem everywhere, right? So you have a user identity at the front end, that's not hard. Take it down to the stack, right? And through all the different trust interchanges you're doing after that. It's a really complicated problem that we don't have really good answers to, and it's just hard, right?
And it's because the government's the only organization that'll pay for it. And the government doesn't pay enough for our commercial vendors to actually implement that shit.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got the tech, right? Jot tokens, you can just chain them all the way down to the bottom.
Exactly.
Nobody will implement a trusted jot.
Every time I go back and I would talk to a product group will tell me how many million or how many billion users are going to use this. And when I go and say, oh, it's for the federal government, they're like, not unless you're going to tell me it's for the federal government of 3/4 of the world. Is there a cost-benefit analysis for me? The reason why when Google came up with this, they came up with it because cost-benefit analysis is I can hit the entire world and use them to use my benefits, use this capability. So.
And I will say that when Duo started, the problem we were trying to solve wasn't the company that we weren't starting with protecting the federal government. We were starting with addressing the security poverty line. That if for a long time, there's sort of been this baseline that, if you want to have strong security policy, you must be this big to ride, and you have to be able to get a bunch of hardware to set up in your environment and all these other things. So the first problem that we started by looking at small and medium-sized businesses where you have a very overworked IT staff, maybe a small dedicated security staff, and trying to make sure that we're simplifying visibility and access controls for those folks. As time has gone on, now we've expanded and moved up chain sort of through that. So that started with adding integration for directory services and not having to replicate your groups that you're already managing through AD or Azure or what have you, and being able to put that directly in. And now that's why I say kind of that's what the next step is looking at those more specialized use cases, like when you're dealing with very highly attractive device-to-device authentications.
And commercial industry, I mean, they've been getting their lunch given to them the same way, right? Intellectual property, almost no company owns anymore of their own. Right? It just doesn't. And it's a really bad problem, right? I mean, that is the main thing that got Google interested in this is, right, oh shit, they can get in here, they can get my IP, and they've got some serious IP, right? Mm-hmm. So we've got to find a way to stop them from getting in our jewels, right? And, that's what the advent of this was, a commercial company, right? And there's many of them out there that actually don't know, they really don't protect themselves any better than OPM protected their assets, right? It's just, so it's not just the government, I think the government's awareness is kind of higher than a lot of, for 3 companies that had really important IP.
I said this about a year ago. Never has the commercial and the federal space been as close as it is today. We're literally in Alaska walking across the frozen tundra. We are, because we're as close as we'll ever be the federal government has always been a decade behind, but with this one issue, the two spaces are as close as they're ever gonna be. And now it's just.
And a lot of it has to do with, we're both using the same platforms. It's all commercially available products, commercially available general purpose operating systems. I mean, that's what everybody's using, so we're in the identical space, right? Even if we look at our risk from perspective, we're paying the exact same tools and no different, except in, certain areas where we know we're making significant investment, right? But that's not what we're talking about in this room.
But just from security perspective, right, there are some agencies that are now running Windows 10, which I was fell out of my chair when I saw them upgrading to 10. I'm like, wait a minute, you skipped a couple of years here. You're already like current.
Yeah.
But I mean that's a small piece of all of this, right? I mean this is the convergence, right? How are we doing this? And like I said, I've never seen the two spaces as close as they have been.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions?